Welcome back to The Situation Room, the weekly show where we take your questions and use them as a springboard to talk about all the ways that the world is alarmingly I'm Simon, and this week we're kicking things off with a deep dive into the growing trend of Chinese PMCs spreading across the world. Or you might have seen some stuff online about how China is setting up its own Wagner group. The reality is a bit more nuanced than that, and honestly a hell of a lot more interesting. Aside from that, we're also taking the temperature of the global threat towards democracies worldwide. Spoiler alert there, it's not looking very good. As usual, timestamps are below, and there'll be a couple of fun questions on history at the end. But for now, let's get into the headline act, shall we? China's growing use of PMCs. Here's our top question this week from Fragman777. With China's continued investment with their Belt and Road Initiative into countries of varying, often not great stability, and the PRC's reluctance to deploy traditional military forces into these regions for a number of reasons, should we expect to see an increase in Chinese state-owned PMCs and their capabilities, similar to Russia's Wagner Group and now Africa Corps? A short answer to that is yes. Right now, China is already well on its way to building a network of private security firms and mercenary groups, and it's deploying those groups all across the world where Chinese Belt and Road projects and other major investments need to be protected. As a report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies explained all the way back in January of 2022, quote, while estimates suggest as many as 20 to 40 Chinese PSCs are operating abroad in some 40 countries, China operates more than 7,000 PSCs domestically, end quote. Now, since the time that report was written, China's arsenal of private security firms has only kept on growing as China's global influence grows more and more deeply entrenched. The long answer, however, is where things really get interesting, because in order to understand the way that China's paramilitary and private mercenary groups operate, we first have to establish that China's approach to the issue is starkly divergent from Russia's. While Moscow has a well-documented love of shadowy, heavily armed mercenaries swashbuckling across the globe with very little concern for the consequences of their actions, China takes a far more thoughtful approach, and it doesn't rely on a single type of non-state actor. If we're going to talk about China's use of mercenary fighting forces, then we have to talk about three distinct groups of operators: Chinese private security firms, armed units under the control of Chinese vassal states, and foreign mercenaries who collaborate with China in order to work toward common goals. The first group, China's private security firms, are similar to Russian, American, and other international mercenary groups, but they come with a twist. With practically zero exceptions, China prefers that any private security company that could be easily tied back to Beijing will strictly avoid engaging in military confrontations. These are not groups that will lead the change against local insurgencies or do the work that a partner nation's own soldiers should be able to accomplish by themselves. It's not unheard of for Chinese security contractors to engage in small skirmishes if they come under direct threat, but their primary objective is to protect both China's economic assets and highly concentrated or especially vulnerable groups of Chinese nationals. To that effect, they engage in both armed and unarmed security operations, taking control over Beijing's assets with its own people instead of relying on an international partner. They provide consulting operations with partner governments, strengthening those host nations in order to ensure that their assets don't risk coming under threat, and they will, at times, provide logistical support or training services. The goal is to be passive whenever possible, using relatively limited funds and weaponry that China deliberately restricts in order to avoid even the slightest hint of a Wagner-style accumulation of power. Those private security firms are active all across the globe. In Central Asia, they've worked to safeguard oil pipelines in Kazakhstan and offer armed guard and close protection services in Kyrgyzstan. In Pakistan, they guard important sites against separatist insurgents in the Balochistan region, while in Afghanistan, they guard against the local branch of the Islamic State. In Myanmar, recent changes to the law have allowed Chinese mercenaries to come in and secure important economic assets and infrastructure, while so-called ceasefire monitoring groups that have rolled into formerly rebel-held cities after pressure from Beijing forced those rebels to retreat might also be made up of Chinese mercenary operators. All across Africa, they watch over Belt and Road infrastructural projects in nations from Libya to Mali to Kenya to Somalia to the Congo. When China does want to take more kinetic approaches to conflicts abroad, it's shown a clear tendency to rely on units under the control of smaller subsidiary vassal states. One such example is the war in Ukraine, where, despite the so-called no-limits partnership, it's not China's troops who are being sent to support Russia. Instead, it's thousands upon thousands of troops from North Korea, not loyal to Beijing directly, but loyal to a regime that is loyal to Beijing in turn. North Korea's conduct in Russia has been sharply curtailed when China sees fit, with North Korea's actions and ambitions seeming to be constrained by China's will. But it's no coincidence that the soldiers of a state largely dependent on China for its survival are fighting to support a fellow ally of Beijing. Now, to be clear, Chinese fighters are actively recruited to fight independently for Russia, but Beijing's involvement in that effort appears to be limited to allowing recruitment content to exist on China's tightly monitored internal internet. Similarly, in the Myanmar conflict, China has long supported the autonomous State, a powerful ethnic army with access to hardware that far outstrips most of Myanmar's other non-state actors. Recently, State has taken a far more active role in securing China's access to critical rare earth mineral mines, locking down territory, and clearing the way for large-scale, urgent Chinese mining operations to begin after the mines that China had previously controlled were captured and held for leverage by a rebel faction. Whether it's North Korean soldiers or State fighters, these are groups that are overtly working to protect China's interests, but they're also in the line of fire where China would prefer that its own troops and private contractors didn't have to go. And finally, there's the murkiest group of all: international mercenary groups that either operate openly at China's behest or seem to be acting in ways that suggest Beijing is their ultimate backer. In some cases, those local mercenary groups are simply bought out by China and used to fulfill the same security and logistical operations that Chinese nationals would be handling otherwise. Cambodia and Laos, for example, are each host to a number of local firms that operate at China's behest, enjoying minimal oversight and providing China the peace of mind that if anything goes wrong, it'll be some other nation's people who get caught in the crossfire. Sometimes, however, the situation is more similar to what's happening in Sudan, where China's extensive interests are under threat from an ongoing, brutal civil war. While Chinese security companies are still on the ground in Sudan protecting those assets, the real story may lie in the flow of recently manufactured Chinese weapons into the conflict zone. Those weapons are not coming directly from China. Instead, they're smuggled in what appear to be quite substantial quantities courtesy of the UAE. The UAE has sent everything from howitzers to unmanned strike drones into the conflict, delivering them to the paramilitary rapid support forces and placing them into the hands of a growing number of international mercenaries, including hundreds or even thousands of mercenary operators from the nation of Colombia. Officially, China backs Sudan's military regime in the civil conflict, and it's not clear whether the UAE's decision to provide Chinese weapons to the RSF is in alignment with China's wishes or not. But between China's economic leverage over the UAE and its status as a critical weapon supplier to the nation, it's highly unlikely that such volumes of advanced weaponry would still be traveling into the hands of the RSF without China's tacit approval. To be clear, we here at WarFronts are not trying to flesh out some direct link between Beijing and Sudan's RSF, at least not today, but in a conflict where ample Chinese interests are at stake, in a world where China strongly prefers to see other foreign nationals fight and die to ensure those interests are protected, the flow of China's weapons matters too. If China, like other major powers, can strengthen groups whose interests align with its own, then China has no need to rely on its own mercenary forces at all. Can democracies survive? Next up, this somewhat terrifying one from LCF de Source. Can democracy survive against authoritarian regimes in the fight for superpower status? How can democracies adapt to this global threat? It's an interesting way of asking the question, framing this issue as a matter of survival for democratic governments instead of a mere matter of friendly competition. But you're right to draw that distinction. In the years following the Cold War, it's been very rare for Western democracies to view battles for relative status as a matter of survival, and that perception of relatively low risk has informed the Western world's approach to relative power contests. But if, as you say, democracies are going to survive in the fight for power that we're witnessing now, then perhaps the most important way they can adapt is to start acting as if it's an existential threat. Over the last several decades, those democracies have operated under the assumption that there's a common set of rules dictating international behavior, that even when nations are battling for relative power, they'll exercise restraint, work diplomatically, be above board in what they're doing, and generally treat international affairs as an extension of polite society. But as those democracies probably should have recognized all along, the rest of the world doesn't particularly care about operating within those sets of constraints. In fact, going by the rhetoric of nations like Russia, China, Iran, and others, the rest of the world never actually believed that Western democracies were exercising the restraint that they were preaching. If they were exercising restraint, then they were creating vacuums of authority and power that other world nations would have been foolish not to try and exploit. As simple as it may sound, the first step to getting ahead in the rat race is to recognize that you are a part of the rat race. Authoritarian regimes have the momentum right now across most of the world, partly because they've made smart, effective use of the opportunities in front of them. But they've also gotten ahead because the Western democracies that held global power at the end of the Cold War have been distracted, willfully self-restrained, and most of all, just complacent. They can honor their preference for diplomatic restraint and politeness, or they can try to win the geopolitical game that's been playing out under their noses. But they can't have both. Behind the scenes. Next up, a couple of behind-the-scenes questions. We often get people asking about our production process, and felt like this week it might be as good a week as any to answer a few. To start, this one from Geordie Valentine. Hello team, this one's for Simon. How's the new studio coming along? Quite well so far. Obviously, it's a big work in progress. It's a big new space that we're occupying. Getting everything up and running is a little bit tricky. Some of the other studios not looking as hot right now, but it's all a work in progress. Also it's got these big high ceilings, and sound is a bit of a nightmare with those, so that's an ongoing adventure. And another one on the production side from Michael Bossy, 3329. Simon, you do a great job on all your channels, keeping the viewer engaged in what you're talking about. Well, thank you, Bossy. What would you say is the key to making an engaging video? Oof. I don't know, one, obviously, credit to the writers. Most of the stuff is them. Second, I think in terms of presentation, I'm generally a pretty interested person. Not interested. I find things interesting. I like learning about all the things that I make videos about. So I think that generally helps in making something engaging. I've definitely made videos where I've been like, oh my God, I don't care. It's so boring. And it shows. So I don't know. As I've gradually made more content, I've just pushed things towards things that I'm interested in. So that helps, I guess. Not a super satisfying answer, I'm sorry.
Your Honor, Terry has tried his best.
Ranking history's dictators, and just before we sign off today, our traditional closing segment where we briefly invite our writers Evan and Morris out of the basement to help with some fun questions. Don't get used to the feeling of sunlight, guys. I'm chaining you up right after this. This one from Simcha Kaplan. Which deceased dictator would be the most influential and successful in today's day and age? Gonna go for Napoleon again. So outside the box, please. Evan says, I mentioned him. Oh, I know who I'm going to choose. It's not Napoleon. It's not Napoleon today. But I have chosen him before for something else, I believe. Evan says, I mentioned him on another episode a couple of months ago, but I'd argue that longtime dictator of Portugal, Antonio Salazar, would have been far more effective and dangerous today than he was in his time, even though he was already quite effective and dangerous back then. Unlike most dictators, Salazar worked mostly from behind the scenes using financial and economic leverage, and he would have had a field day with the financial systems of the modern day. This is drawing parallels to the guy that I have choosing, I think. Between the ongoing global merger between powerful corporations and powerful governments, the rise of cryptocurrency-based illicit finance networks, and the vast unregulated world of modern grey zone economics, that guy would have been a force of nature. Morris says, I feel like the boring truth is that every historical dictator is a product of their time and likely wouldn't be able to amass or wield power in the same way that they had been if they were born into different circumstances. I mean, look at Stalin's rise. To get Uncle Joe sat in Moscow overseeing the deaths of millions, you'd first have to engineer the collapse of an imperial dynasty that had stood for centuries, which itself involves the greatest war mankind has yet seen breaking out, all because some random archduke got shot. Then you have to make sure that the Bolsheviks win their power struggle against the Mensheviks. Then you need the charismatic leader who sets up the Soviet Union to die at the age of 53. And then you need to make sure that the other candidates to replace Lenin are too weak, gullible, or stupid to outmaneuver Stalin. And then you get the point. That's not the sort of career path that you can plan out from your small Georgian backwater. It's the same with most of the other dictators you can name. Absent the Great War, Hitler's just a failed artist with kooky racial ideas. Mussolini's just a journalist, and so on. Or look at the present day. Is there anything inherent in Vladimir Putin's character that means he was destined to rule Russia? Or did you just get double lucky with the collapse of the USSR throwing everything into chaos and the guy who led the country in the 90s being an incompetent drunk who failed to set up a stable democratic system? The fact that nearly every other Eastern European state except Belarus transitioned to a Western-style democracy suggests the latter. My choice is the Singapore dude again, Lee Kuan Yew. He was like technocratic back in the day, building Singapore into a financial powerhouse. And I think just with the technology and everything and the data of today, he'd do even better. Right? Hostage situations. And finally, from anonymized handle, if you were to be held captive for 60 days by a currently operational violent non-state actor, but you got to choose your captor, who would it be? Oh God, they all suck. I'll let Evan go first, who says, it's a real shame that Catalonia, violence, doesn't host an active insurgency. We could all do a lot worse than a Barcelona holiday. But looking at my current slate of options, I'd probably choose one of the insurgent groups in Myanmar, and ideally one of the groups that holds territory far from any active frontline areas. For example, the township of Mindat, controlled by the ethnic Cho people in Chin State, is certainly a place where life is quite difficult, but it hasn't seen active battle since 2021 and is not a frequent target of the regime's bombing campaign. It also doesn't have many scam centers, meaning that I'm unlikely to be kidnapped and forced to spend the rest of my life extorting English-speaking victims around the world. I'd like to think I could get through a couple of months in a place like Mindat and make a few friends along the way. Alternately, a city like Merak-U in the zone controlled by the Iraqi army has a stunning cultural history and was the capital of a historical kingdom. So if I were taken there and my captors would allow me to visit the occasional historic site, I think I could get into that arrangement. And yes, I have thought about this question before. Morris says, given Simon is already holding us captive in the basement, I doubt the experience would be much different from our current lives. You goddamn right, Morris. Joking aside, Can I be kidnapped by someone I broadly agree with? Belarus has a small number of partisan groups that are engaged in sabotage against the regime and Russian forces stationed there. I imagine getting kidnapped by them would mostly involve me giving them the thumbs up after each operation and saying, good work, lads. They might even let me out. Maybe I could spray paint a wall, Russians go home, in the style of Graham Chapman in Monty Python's Life of Brian. I don't have a brilliant answer. I'm just going to say not ISIS, dude. Anyone but ISIS. Thanks for watching.